if you've ever looked at a cave painting or scrolled an emoji-filled text and wondered, where does writing really come from? Was it just a bunch of people in ancient Mesopotamia trying to keep tabs on barley? And why do some scripts die while others evolve for millennia? And why did Socrates hate the very idea of writing so much? If questions like those keep you up at night, or at least mildly intrigued, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing Writing and Script, a very short introduction by Andrew Robinson. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and this is part of my ongoing playlist for the very short introduction series. These books are part of the research I do for my other channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan, which is all about long-form storytelling for students and curious minds alike. If you're interested, please go check that out. Because these books feed directly into my lectures and scripts, I try to give detailed reviews. I'll walk through a chapter-by-chapter summary. I'll highlight some key argumentative distinctions and share some what I think to be really fascinating takeaways, and of course wrap up with who this book is for and who it's not for. But first, let's take a look at the author. This is a slightly different author. In most of these series, especially the history-related ones, the author tends to be a professional historian and usually some kind of academic. In this case, our author is William Andrew Robinson. He was born in 1957, just to give you an idea of how old he is. He is a British writer and former newspaper editor. Robinson received his education at the Dragon School, which is just a really coolly named private school. I'm sure the fact that it's actually a private school is far less interesting. And then he went to Eton College, where he was a King's Scholar before studying chemistry at University College of Oxford. He also pursued studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. His first trip to India was in 1975. I mention that because it sparked a lifelong engagement with Indian culture, and he has since authored numerous books and articles, including one of his relatively more recent ones, India, A Short History. That came out actually probably about a decade ago. But anyways, Robinson has also served as the literary editor of the Times Higher Education Supplement until 2006, and he has held a visiting fellowship at Wolfson College, Cambridge. So he does have considerable experience of, if not teaching, at least engaging in an academic atmosphere. He currently lives in London and works as a full-time writer. In addition to this book, he has authored or edited dozens of other books, especially ones pertaining to India and famous Indian thinkers, as well as several on Albert Einstein. And some others that are related specifically to the development in writing include ones like The Story of Writing, Alphabets, Hieroglyphs, and Pictograms. I believe that came out in like 2000 or 2002. The Man Who Deciphered Linear B, The Story of Michael Ventris. That one came out in 2002. Lost Languages, The Enigma of the World's Great Undeciphered Scripts. That also came out in 2002. Clearly, he was very interested in scripts at the time. Cracking the Egyptian Code, The Revolutionary Life of Jean-Francois Champollion. That came out in 2012, and then this one also came out in 2012. So that is the background that he has. He clearly has a deep interest in this particular field, but let's take a look at the chapter-by-chapter arguments and ideas that he presents in a short introduction. These are the main things that he felt like you should know about taking on such a big field. So in chapter 1, it is called Writing and Its Emergence. In this, Robinson opens by distinguishing between spoken language, which is innate and universal, and writing, which is an artificial invention that only arose in pretty complex societies. This is one of the defining and distinguishing features of our earliest societies, and what would go on to make them very different from just other Neolithic large farming villages. This development of writing played a key role. So he explores examples of proto-writing, so stuff that you might see in Ice Age cave paintings, or some uses of tallies or quipus, which I've mentioned before in some of my other videos on my other channel. That is, of course, a really interesting way of tracking stuff using knots and cords. This was most famously done in the Incan Empire, but also some of the civilizations that came before the Incas used it as well. The Corral River civilization, which was much older than the Incas, would probably also use that, and it seemed to have been passed down. And of course, this distinguishes them from full writing, which can express any thought or language in a structured system. And so writing likely arose due to administrative needs, particularly in Mesopotamia and slightly later in Egypt in the late 4th millennium BCE. He discusses the clay tokens and the boule and the early pictograms as forerunners of writing, concluding with the Rubus principle, or a key innovation that allowed writing to encode abstract language phonetically. If you go watch my other videos, the prime example of that is that in cuneiform, you of course see more abstract ideas being used, and so you might have a symbol for sky that goes on to eventually mean like heaven, and even an idea of divinity or a god. And then the next big stage comes with when you realize that the word for something like water, which I don't remember exactly what it would have been in Sumerian, I think it probably was like ma or something, but that was also the same sound you made for the preposition in. The reason that is important is because it's a lot harder to draw something that stands for in, but as soon as you realize that, oh, when I draw water, the word I use for water is so similar sounding, or maybe identically sounding, to the word for in, I can now use this symbol to represent a sound and not just a concept. And that is a huge leap. Some of the interesting facts that I found in this particular chapter was, of course, that the first real writing wasn't for literature or laws or any of the most beautiful things that have come from civilization, but it was to keep track of beer and barley. All sorts of trading, but that actually the earliest tokens we have seem to be directly connected to beer and barley in particular. And then, of course, I would say another interesting fact from this chapter was this idea of the Rubus principle, something I've already referenced, and using pictures to represent sounds, and how that helps scripts move from drawings to full-on writing. Chapter 2, Development and Diffusion of Writing. This chapter charts how writing systems emerged and spread across civilizations. Robinson reviews the earliest independent inventions of writing in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and possibly the Indus Valley. This is a fascinating chapter because all of these different places develop pretty distinct forms of writing. And that goes to show that there is something special about how we develop writing. And at the same time, it's not something that automatically happens, and it is not a natural product, although it does seem to be a key element in this development of early city building civilizations. And so he outlines in this the debate between independent invention and stimulus diffusion. In other words, writing that just happened in other places, or how there may have been something, even if there wasn't necessarily direct contact, but there was something that was causing them to develop writing at the same time. Maybe trade made it so that different parts, even if they didn't use the same script, even if they didn't even care to learn each other's script, the simple act of having this long-distance trade may have somehow encouraged them to develop their own form of writing. And of course, he notes that while contact was possible between civilization, each script seems to have evolved to suit completely local needs. And the chapter includes a comparative timeline of writing systems and explains how scripts like cuneiform, the oldest script that we have been able to decipher, and I believe the oldest real script that we have. Of course, you have hieroglyphics, which is famously, that's actually a broader term frequently, but it should specifically refer to the Egyptian form of writing, because at the heart, the name of the word hieroglyphics is specifically a reference to the writing of the Egyptians that was a reference to the gods. And then you have linear A and B. Those are going to be what are used by the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and the earliest form of writing that will eventually become part of Greek writing, and then Chinese characters. And they all developed to meet the demands of trade, religion, and governance. And they are so interesting in the way they look, whether we've been able to interpret them, and just their development. And I would say that one of the more interesting facts from this chapter is just the fact that major scripts arose independently and not all from a single origin point seems to be the prevailing theory, but it's still to be debated. Obviously, there's a lot of questions that we just cannot answer. Chapter 3, Disappearance of Scripts. Many ancient scripts disappeared over time, especially as cultures changed or collapsed. And so the author discusses the loss of literacy in, for example, the Greek Dark Ages, and the extinction of scripts such as Etruscan or Linear A, and one that he actually spends a fair amount of time on, and I found this one the more interesting, it was Rongorongo, which is what was written on the Easter Islands, and we to this day have not been able to translate it. And it's one of these just more fascinating languages because it's such a smaller population. It is a rather elaborate form of writing, and just we're kind of at a loss. We hit a point where we say, well, unless more information is uncovered, we just have no way of really learning this language. The many languages that we have had to go back and learn how to translate, such as hieroglyphics and even cuneiform, I mean, frequently it just took a crazy fortunate turn to even make it possible. And on top of that, having a significant number of examples to draw from is a key part of that. And most of these languages, I mean, Etruscan, I don't know how many examples we have of Etruscan, but I don't think it's a ton. Same with Rongo, considering the size of the population, just isn't enough. And so he highlights how behind this script extinction, it includes stuff like imperial conquests and religious conversion. An example of that is, of course, the Christianization of the Roman Empire means you're going to see a significant shift in the way that language is going to be remembered, as Latin will become the language of early Western Christianity, and to this day has an impact on it, and is going to be one of the key tools for spreading the Latin alphabet. It might seem to make sense for some languages, especially those that are related to Latin, but what about all the Germanic languages that have now adopted a Latin script when they themselves are not a Latin language, a Latin-based language? And that's really worth considering when you just think about the fact that the sounds that we make in, say, English, not a Latin-based language, that don't match up with some of the sounds you have in your Romance languages, and then vice versa. And if you know anything about the rune system that was the first writing form for English, you know that there are symbols for sounds that we no longer make in English, or that we do make in English, and it just is a better representation than the efforts that were used to force Latin to fit into our speaking style. And you have a lot of examples for that. Arabic and Persian, and of course Latin just in general, you have a lot of issues with matching it up with the actual way a language is spoken. And then of course you have some scripts like Egyptian hieroglyphics that persisted for millennia due to their religious significance. The chapter considers the fragility of writing systems and how easily they can vanish when no longer used. And like I said, you have a lot of examples of languages that we probably will never be able to decipher. And we have just these few pieces of their writings, and we're very curious as to what exactly they say, and we'll probably never know. Chapter 4 is Decipherment and Undeciphered Scripts. Here the author gives a brief history of some of the most important decipherments. So probably the best example, that most famous, would be Champollion's decoding of the Egyptian hieroglyphics via the Rosetta Stone. There's a long, fascinating story behind that. Of course, he would be one to know that. It seems though he wrote a book about it. The decipherment of Cuneiform was also very interesting. It used the Behistun inscription and Michael Venturus's decipherment of Linear B. These are all just some examples of requiring incredibly intelligent people, large sample sizes, but also some real strokes of luck. The example of that being the Rosetta Stone. He explains in this chapter that the challenges posed by scripts like Linear A and Rogorongo and the Indus script, something that, my goodness, archaeologists would love to be able to decipher, they all remain undeciphered largely due to the absence of any kind of bilingual text and an unknown underlying language. So when we don't know what exactly they spoke in the Indus Valley, we have real trouble in trying to take our samples of the language and working backwards from there. If we don't even know what the language was, we don't even know what it was tied to, in if it is connected to any living languages. The first written language, Sumerian, is not actually connected to any living language. Oddly, that may have been one of the things that really benefited it, because when they developed cuneiform and other completely unrelated languages used their cuneiform and forced it to work on their languages, that actually helped to solidify the legacy of Sumerian as well as cuneiform as a whole. And so we have been able to translate, and we know what Sumerian was like. I say that, we probably may not actually know how it was spoken. We may only be able to do it explicitly based off of script, but I could be wrong about that. That would be an interesting question to look into. Anyways, this process of decipherment is both technical and there's an element of it being intuitive, And so it can require deep knowledge of languages and scripts and cultural context. And then there's those times where it just seems to be a bit of a hunch. And so I think the best example of that is Michael Ventris, who he was an architect, and he had no formal deep linguistic training, but he's the one that cracked linear B, mostly using just some elements of logic, but also he used place names, and that was his key to finally cracking linear B. Of course, linear A remains one of the more elusive scripts that we've never been able to transcribe. Also, I think I've already referenced the Rosetta Stone. That's a story probably most of you know about, but if you don't, just real quickly, during the invasion of Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars, they discovered, Napoleon took with him a bunch of historians and some, I guess, aspiring Egyptologists. I don't know how great of an Egyptologist she could be if we couldn't even read the language yet, but they discovered a stone that had hieroglyphics as well as 2 other languages. And we know the other 2 languages. Those could be read. I want to say it include a form of Greek and then also another form of the Egyptian language, but in a different script. I don't remember as demonic or hieratic. But it was one of those 2. And so they were able to, using those 3 different languages, well, I guess using those 2 other languages, finally pin down or at least get a start on hieroglyphics. And it really was just taking a few key things that could help them finally figure it out. And if you don't know, the big thing for hieroglyphics was figuring out that the name of rulers, maybe been everyone, but rulers in particular, were put into a special circle, which is called a cartouche, which is actually just French for a shotgun shell. And that became the key way of identifying a language or a person's name, and that was how they could finally say, oh, well, this matches this on this script, and worked their way backwards. That was the key part of it. I found that really interesting. Chapter 5, how writing systems work. This is where Robinson categorizes scripts by structure. So do you have a logographic one, so one symbol and one word, kind of like in Chinese, although usually they're actually made up of several symbols, but you get the idea. Or is it syllabic, so one symbol equals one syllable? Or is it alphabetic, which of course is one symbol equals one sound, with some variation in there. And then he introduces the concept of phoneticism, or the degree to which writing reflects actual spoken sounds. And this chapter includes examples like the Maya glyphs, or of course Egyptian script, and linear B, ones that we've already referenced, to show some mixed systems. He also introduces semantic determinatives, or compound characters, or directionality of script, so left to right, top to bottom. A lot of different things he introduces here about what is so much more to consider about scripts than what you probably haven't thought about if you have not deliberately considered, oh, what are some of the reasons why different scripts were developed and why might they have different features. And he really emphasizes how different writing systems handle the balance between meaning and sound, because it is not going to be the same all across the systems. And then he takes a look in chapter 6 at alphabets, and he explores the history and power of alphabetic scripts, beginning with the Proto-Sinaitic script, which is an ancestor of Phoenician. And then from Phoenician, the Greek alphabet was derived, which added vowels. That is a huge difference. If you know anything about Semitic languages, which Phoenician was, they do not have short vowels written in, and so that was something that the Greeks came along and added to it. Probably, again, similar to what I talked about with Sumerian, how it actually was not related to the later languages that used cuneiform is one of the things that probably helped to benefit it. Similar here with the Phoenicians, because they spoke a completely different language, not even in the same language family as the Greeks, that is when the Greeks realized they had to make some adaptations to make this script work, and that is where, of course, we're going to get vowels, a major innovation. And then, of course, Greek is going to influence Latin, which underpins most European scripts today. And so then the author describes how the Roman and the Arabic and the Brahmi alphabets and their global reach all emphasize how these systems adapted to local languages. And the alphabet's simplicity makes it easy to learn, which helped spread literacy. But the author warns against assuming that alphabets are superior to logographic or syllabic systems. They are easier to learn, but they also have considerable drawbacks. And so I found that just a very interesting discussion of the various scripts and what are the challenges and what are the major differences between them. So in chapter 7, he specifically takes a look at Chinese and Japanese writing. These are two very well-known, powerful languages in terms of the amount of speakers and coming from very affluent countries in particular, and yet they are also very difficult languages for anyone, particularly the writing, for anyone to learn that is not raised reading them. That being said, both of these languages, their main home countries, China and Japan, have phenomenal literacy rates. And so this chapter focuses on East Asian writing systems, especially Chinese and its influence on Japanese, although there's also a discussion of Korean in there. And the author explains that the structure of Chinese characters, which combine phonetic and semantic components, he explores how classical calligraphy and the invention of paper and printing and the challenges of adapting Chinese script to Japanese, and how it's a completely grammatically different language. You don't have tones in Japanese in the same way that you do in Chinese. You do conjugate in Japanese in a way that you don't in Chinese. And then he takes a look in Japan, how you have your various forms of writing. So you have kanji, which is essentially Chinese characters being adapted to the Japanese script. You also have hiragana, and then you have katakana, and they all evolved to handle things differently, whether it's native words or borrowed words, and of course grammar. And so the author also mentions efforts at script simplification and the enduring cultural prestige of Chinese writing. That's probably one of the more fascinating ones. You have an effort at creating a simplified Chinese. That's actually what most Chinese speakers are going to use. That is what is used in mainland China, but it is still very complicated. And if you have been anywhere where they use the traditional script in, say, Taiwan, which when I visited, I think also in Hong Kong you can see this, where they will put both scripts. I think it was in Disneyland in Hong Kong, where I saw that they would put both the classical Chinese, the traditional Chinese script, as well as the simplified Chinese, and they don't actually look all that dramatically different. So this idea that it was, it greatly simplified, it just seems like that might not be entirely the case. But that was, a rather ignorant person in myself trying to compare the two. They felt like it was different enough that they did have to include both scripts. I will say, even with that simplification, just one of the things that's really interesting about the Chinese characters is that we have evidences of them from about 1200 BCE on the tortoise shells, the oracle bones as they're called, and they actually still closely resemble their modern form. This is one of the really interesting things about how complicated the language is, and yet still how similar it is to the oldest forms of it. We're talking 3,000 years of a writing legacy. I should also point out with Chinese, it's worth noting that because of its structure, that also means that you can read it without actually completely speaking it. And for that reason, something a lot of people don't realize when it comes to Chinese, we talk about Chinese, you may even say Mandarin, but when you're talking about the written form, it's just one form. It's Chinese. So whether you're speaking Mandarin or Cantonese or one of the many other languages that are distinct languages, although China will try to tell you they're dialects, they really are really quite different in many ways, and yet they can all read the same script just because the structure of it. And that's one of the more interesting things about the Chinese script, and also one of the advantages to learning it, and learning it even if you are not a native speaker. That goes beyond just communicating with people that speak Mandarin as a first language. You can obviously communicate with any of the people that read Chinese. In chapter 8, Scribes and Materials, we take a look at writing, which is not just about language, and we take a look on how it depends on materials and tools. This chapter explores the craft of writing. So cuneiform on clay tablets, hieroglyphs on stone, and ink on papyrus and parchment and paper. And he discusses that scribes, as elite professionals, often trained in religious or bureaucratic settings, which of course would affect what they learn and what they're writing. And the chapter reviews tools like the styluses or the pens and the brushes and the different writing surfaces. And it just notes that material constraints shaped script development. It affected how long stuff could last. It affected how transportable stuff was. There was a lot to take into consideration. And so for instance, hieratic and demotic Egyptian scripts became more cursive on papyrus, and they were not nearly as elaborate as the hieroglyphics, and so it made it much easier to use. And the author emphasizes how writing materials affected legibility, storage, and accessibility, and that's very true. One of the things that affects how much we know about ancient civilizations is how many records we still have from them, and the durability of their script is a big part of that. And of course, fortunately, since we can translate the hieroglyphics in Egypt and we can translate the cuneiform in the Fertile Crescent, those are civilizations that we can study in pretty significant detail. Same with the oracle bones and the subsequent languages in China. But then we have plenty of places where they maybe had a written script, or even if we know they had a written script, we just can't translate it. And that, of course, will affect just how much we know about that civilization. Chapter 9, Writing Goes Electric. So the final chapter considers the digital age, including typewriting, word processing, and of course mobile texting. So the author asks whether electronic media changed the nature of writing. He discusses emojis and visual shortcuts as a form of proto-writing and the decline of handwriting in favor of typing. He warns against technological determinism, in other words, arguing that although tools change, that the cognitive function of writing remains consistent. And Robinson closes by considering how global communication might affect writing systems, especially whether English and the Latin alphabet will dominate or whether local scripts will persist and adapt. And this is the chapter in which he engages with Socrates, and he points out that Socrates, of course, feared writing. He thought it would make people forgetful. He thought it gave the illusion of wisdom without understanding. And I actually think that there's a fair argument to be made there. I do think that in a day where we think we have all of the world's wisdom just available on our phones and our computers, I mean, it's true, but there is still considerable value in what is stored information in your head. And that is because it makes it easier for you to engage with new information. Yes, you do have incredible resources in getting information or even recalling information that you might not know. But having stored information, I think there is real value in that. And I think Socrates was onto something, although I don't know if I'd completely agree with him choosing to be completely illiterate, but that may just be me. So let me talk about some of the argumentative distinctions in this book. In other words, what are some of the key things that he is emphasizing, or things that he is saying there is still debate to determine whether it's true or not, and just whether that matters. So first of all, he talks about language versus writing, and he discusses how language is natural and universal, but writing is artificial and rare. Like I said, it does not necessarily happen. So not all societies have developed writing, and those that did used it to serve their specific economic, religious, and political functions. Just because we see the earliest form of writing in Mesopotamia includes ways of counting for barley and beer does not mean that everywhere else used it for that same reason. Also, he points out that proto-writing and full writing has some important distinctions. So for example, proto-writing includes tallying sticks and cave signs, and like I said, the boule, and how they can convey limited, often non-phonetic information. However, full writing is designed to capture speech and thought. So the Rubus principle is central to this transformation. Next, he argues that script type is not a hierarchy. Alphabets are often considered superior due to modern Western biases, but logographic, such as Chinese, and syllabic, such as Japanese kana or linear B, they are systems that are equally valid and effective and do have their advantages. That's how they persist. Then he argues for the multiple independent inventions theory. Like I said, there are competing theories here, and this is the one that he goes for. Stimulus diffusion explains some script development. So in other words, there being some contact. He stresses that by and large, independent invention of writing in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and Mesoamerica is by and large how writing was created. And so he tends to critique the imperialist assumptions that all writing systems stemmed from a single source, usually either hieroglyphics or cuneiform. For a long time, and I could be overstepping, but I was under the impression that they weren't entirely sure which one started first. We do know that urbanization started in Mesopotamia before it started in Egypt, but when it did finally start in Egypt, there seemed to be a sense of an already developed element of culture, especially in terms of something like writing. I think recent years have shown that not only did city buildings start sooner, so the urbanization of Mesopotamia, but also it seems like they probably started on writing before they did in Egypt, which, you know, still raises the question of what kind of impact did that have, if any, on Egypt. And I don't know, It's part of the debate that he goes into. He also talks about the cultural specificity of scripts. So writing systems reflect their societies. Scripts often arose in temple or court context, and their evolution was shaped by materials and education systems and administrative demands. This is one of the big things that he's arguing, or talked about in one of the chapters. And then his big points that he makes is this idea of writing and memory. And again, referencing Socrates, he questions whether writing enhances or erodes memory and wisdom, and he acknowledges that writing externalizes thought, but it may also weaken internal memorization, and this is a long-standing belief. The last thing he really argues is this fragility of the ability to write, and he talks about how scripts are fragile. Scripts can disappear due to conquest or disuse or technological change, and without use or transmission, they die, often taking knowledge with them. And so the author stresses the historical contingency of script survival. In other words, he is really plugging the need to keep scripts alive. So who is this book for? Well, if you're fans of other very short introductions, especially if you're collecting or researching them or using them for some kind of educational YouTube channel, I think this is certainly one that you would find interesting. I think students and teachers and writers who love language or history or archaeology will certainly find something that they enjoy about this. I also think this will appeal to anyone that's interested in how writing actually began, and not just, you know, what you learned in elementary school about how to shape your letters. I think that'll appeal to anyone that's curious. And I think that linguistics fans, or those that are curious about things like semiotics and the symbols, or if you're looking for a global overview of human writing, I do think this will appeal to you. However, it probably won't appeal to you if you were expecting maybe a deep dive into a single script. He just does not have space for that, and it doesn't matter. That's really not the point. Exploring only one script is only giving more power to the idea that one specific script is more valuable than another. I think that you can certainly make an argument that that's not the case, although there is a prevalent use of, probably Latin script would be the most common one because of all the languages that use it. But again, that's showing my Western bias, because there are so many speakers of Chinese that you could argue that that is also an incredibly valuable script. It probably outnumbers, maybe not all of the languages that use a Latin script, but it's probably getting pretty close. And so I think that that's a valuable point. But for that reason, you're not going to find an exploration of a single script in this. I'd also say people that really want extensive visuals, or maybe some kind of decipherment exercises, you're not quite going to get that, although this does certainly include diagrams and a fair amount of pictures, I think enough to make it engaging. But you do have to realize that this is going to be predominantly driven by prose, and that is just something to remember when you're looking at such a short introduction. That's just how things have to work, and so you have to be able to visualize a fair amount of things, but there are pictures, to be clear. I'd also say that if you're looking for technical linguistics or literary theory, this is, much more about history and anthropology. So I would, dissuade anyone that's looking for something more along the lines of those elements. And I'd also say that if you're just not particularly curious about how writing evolved, or you don't really care about one of the most important inventions in humanity, then hey, maybe it's not for you. But I sure hope it is, especially if you've made it to this point in a video about writing, then it probably is for you. All in all, I'd say that this book, Writing and Script, a very short introduction, is both a celebration of human ingenuity and a meditation on fragility and adaptation that is necessary for written language. So far more than an inventory of scripts or anything like that, the book argues that writing is a social tool or a cultural artifact, and it is a technological practice, not merely a mirror of speech, but it is a force that reshapes thought, and with that, it reshapes memory, and with that comes considerable power. So if you've ever wondered where writing came from, or its spread and why it matters, then I do think this is a book worth picking up. It is a compact, but I think it is a very interesting read. And you might even change the way you think about something like a keyboard or a notebook, or maybe even the next emoji that you send in a text. Of course, you will find this review in my very short introduction playlist, where you can watch my other short introduction reviews. And if you are interested, again, I am using this for research for my other channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan. If that's interesting to you, please go check that out. I'd love to know your guys' thought on this book in particular, especially in the arguments that he makes, or any other books in this series, if you care to discuss them, or anything about the development of writing, or any other sources that you think might be of interest to me. Please let me know in the comments. I'd love to have a conversation going. If you are enjoying this video or any of my other materials, please share it. Share it on the social media. Share it wherever you feel like I can get just a little more of a reach and have a little more impact. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.